Judge Frank Caprio sat at the bench that morning, the familiar rhythm of his courtroom echoing softly around him. Because this morning Judge Caprio was about to meet David Lawson, a young attorney who had mistaken confidence for wisdom. The courtroom was full, yet calm. The morning light streamed through tall arched windows, cutting across the polished wood in golden streaks. The regulars, officers, clerks, and locals waiting for their hearings, all seemed relaxed, unaware that the next case would turn into one of those unforgettable moments where experience quietly humbles ego. The clerk adjusted her glasses and called out, "Next matter, citation number 10932, speeding violation, Attorney David Lawson." A few heads turned. You could feel the curiosity flicker through the room. A lawyer defending himself for a traffic ticket wasn't something you saw every day. From the third row, David Lawson stood up, tall, crisp, and deliberate. His suit was perfectly pressed, his shoes polished to a mirror shine. He walked to the podium with the stride of a man who'd never doubted himself a day in his life. At just 34, he already carried himself like someone used to winning. "Good morning." "Counselor," Judge Caprio greeted, voice warm but curious. "Good morning." "Your Honor," David replied confidently. "I'll be representing myself." Caprio raised an eyebrow. Brave choice. A few quiet chuckles floated through the benches. David didn't laugh. He offered a small nod and began flipping through his documents, focused, serious, almost rehearsed. Everyone in the room felt it, the tension between youthful arrogance and seasoned patience. Caprio watched him carefully, recognizing the look instantly. He'd seen it hundreds of times before, the young professional who thought the courtroom was a chessboard, and that experience could be outplayed by cleverness. But this courtroom wasn't about winning. It was about learning. And today David Lawson was about to learn a lesson he'd never forget. The case was simple, a speeding citation, 42 miles per hour in a 25 zone near a school crossing. Clear skies, no heavy traffic. The officer's note was short but clear. Speed verified twice by radar. To most people it would have been a fine and a story to tell later. But David didn't like losing, not even in something this small. He began confidently. "Your Honor, this citation is inaccurate. I was within an acceptable variance. The radar reading is unreliable." Judge Caprio leaned forward slightly, listening. "Acceptable variance, Counselor." David nodded, straight-faced. "Yes, Your Honor. Within 2 miles an hour. Hardly grounds for penalty." Caprio's lips curved into a knowing smile. "And where did you learn radar engineering, Mr. Lawson?" Laughter rippled through the courtroom. A few officers exchanged amused looks. David's smile stiffened. "Common sense, Your Honor," he replied, his tone polite but tight. Caprio chuckled. Common sense, the most uncommon law degree of all." The courtroom laughed louder this time. Even the clerk behind her desk tried not to smile. David adjusted his tie, trying to keep composure. "If I may continue," Caprio raised a hand gently. "By all means," David went on, confident but irritated. "Your Honor, I was moving with the flow of traffic. The officer may have clocked another car. I assure you this citation is a misunderstanding." Caprio looked down at the report again. The officer says here the radar reading was verified twice, once at 42, once at 43. "That's impossible," David said quickly. "Radar devices are prone to interference. They can reflect signals from metal, nearby vehicles." "Nearby vehicles," Caprio interrupted calmly. "Or perhaps your own." The laughter came again. Small, restrained, but sharp enough to sting. David forced a smirk. "Respectfully, Your Honor, this isn't about laughter. It's about technical error." Caprio nodded. "I see. And how long have you been practicing law, Counselor?" "Almost 2 years," David replied proudly. Caprio smiled faintly. 2 years. Then I'm sure you'll appreciate a quick lesson in courtroom humility." The audience chuckled again. The young lawyer blinked, unsure whether to laugh or brace himself. The judge leaned back, folding his hands. His tone stayed calm, his words deliberate. "Counselor, this radar reading wasn't taken by an amateur. Officer Daniels has 12 years on the force and a perfect accuracy record. You're questioning not just the ticket, but the integrity of a man who served this city longer than you've practiced law." David hesitated, then replied, "I mean no disrespect, Your Honor, but everyone makes mistakes, even officers." Caprio nodded. True, but the difference, counselor, is that Officer Daniels didn't interrupt me mid-sentence to explain it. Laughter rolled through the courtroom. David's jaw tightened. The balance of the room had shifted, and everyone could feel it. Caprio looked down at his papers again, his expression soft but steady. "Tell me, Mr. Lawson, do you have children?" David shook his head. "No, Your Honor." Caprio's tone lightened slightly. "I do, grandkids too. They're the reason I care so much about these school zone violations. When I read your report, I don't just see a number on a radar gun. I see a car moving too fast near a place where a child might cross." The room quieted. The humor faded, replaced by something heavier, understanding. David didn't respond right away. His voice softened. "I didn't mean any harm, Judge. I really didn't think I was speeding." Caprio nodded slowly. "I believe you. But this isn't about harm. It's about humility." The judge's words hung in the air like sunlight after rain, calm, warm, and unarguable. "You're a good lawyer," Caprio continued. "You have intelligence, confidence, and skill. But remember, son, wisdom doesn't shout. It listens." David lowered his eyes for a moment, realizing this case wasn't about the ticket anymore, it was about him. For a moment, the courtroom felt like a classroom. The teacher, quiet, experienced, compassionate, had just turned a simple infraction into a profound lesson. "Let me tell you something, counselor," Caprio said softly. "In my 40 years on this bench, I've seen two kinds of attorneys. Those who argue to win and those who argue to understand. The first wins cases. The second earns respect." David said nothing. The smirk was gone. The confidence had cracked. And in its place was something new, awareness. The older judge smiled faintly. "I wonder which one you'll choose to be." The benches were silent. No one dared whisper. No one even moved. Caprio leaned forward once more. "Now, Mr. Lawson, shall we get to the truth of your case?" David nodded quietly. "Yes, Your Honor." The audience could feel it. The duel was no longer about radar guns or technicalities. It had become something deeper, something far more important, and Judge Frank Caprio, ever patient, was about to deliver a lesson David Lawson would never forget. Judge Frank Caprio leaned slightly forward, his expression calm, his tone measured, but everyone in the room could feel the weight of his words coming. David Lawson stood at the podium, his confidence dimmed but not gone. He was a man learning, not yet surrendering. The judge glanced over the citation again, then back to David. "You said earlier, counselor, that you were with the flow of traffic. How fast were the other cars going?" David hesitated. "I'd estimate about 35, maybe 40. Caprio nodded thoughtfully. "And yet the speed limit was 25 near a school zone. So you're saying you were keeping pace with others, breaking the law?" The laughter that followed was gentle but pointed. David pressed his lips together. "I only meant—" Caprio held up a hand. "It's all right, counselor. I know what you meant. But sometimes the words we choose tell the truth better than we intend." The audience went quiet again. David exhaled slowly. "With respect, Your Honor, I believe the radar gun misread my speed. That's all." Caprio's voice softened almost like a parent's. "And I believe you believe that. But here's the question, Mr. Lawson. Do you believe it enough to stop talking and start listening?" David blinked. "Sir?" The judge smiled faintly. "You've been defending your case since the moment you walked in. But I'm wondering, counselor, have you tried understanding it?" The air thickened with the weight of his words. Even the officers leaned in slightly, sensing that this exchange was no longer about speeding. It was about something far bigger. Caprio picked up a pen, tapping it gently on the file. "How old are you, son?" 34. "And how long have you been practicing law?" "Almost 2 years, Your Honor." Caprio nodded. 2 years. That's enough to think you know everything, and not nearly enough to realize you don't. A few quiet chuckles rippled through the courtroom. Even David cracked a reluctant smile. The judge leaned back, his eyes kind but sharp. "You remind me of myself once. Young, full of confidence, thought the law was something you conquer, not something you serve." David looked up. Surprised, Caprio continued, "When I was your age, I once told an older judge he was wrong, in open court. I was sure of it. I had all my facts, all my logic. He didn't argue with me. He simply said, 'Mr. Caprio, someday you'll understand that being right isn't the same as being wise.' It took me years to understand what he meant. The courtroom was completely silent now. Not a shuffle, not a whisper. Caprio smiled softly. "And now I'm passing that lesson to you." David nodded slowly. "I'd appreciate that, Your Honor." Caprio set the file down gently. "Tell me, Mr. Lawson, what firm are you with?" "Lawson and Green, Your Honor." Caprio's eyebrow raised slightly, his tone lightening. "Ah, yes, Lawson and Green. I've heard of your firm. Good reputation. I believe I read something about you once." David smiled faintly, regaining a bit of confidence. "Yes, Your Honor. We take pride in our ethics and client service." Caprio leaned forward slightly, a twinkle in his eye. "Yes, that's what I recall. On your firm's website under values, it says, and I quote, 'We uphold integrity, respect, and humility in every courtroom we enter.'" The words dropped like a stone into still water. The room froze. Every head turned toward David. Caprio's voice remained calm. "Did you write that, Counselor?" David's throat tightened. "I contributed to it, yes." Caprio smiled kindly. "Then perhaps you'll allow me to hold you to your own words." A murmur of amusement spread across the benches. Not mocking laughter. The kind that comes from witnessing something undeniably true. David's face turned slightly red. "I didn't mean to come across as what?" Caprio asked gently. David sighed. "As disrespectful, Your Honor." Caprio nodded slowly, his expression warm but firm. "Good. Because, Counselor, let me tell you something that most law schools don't teach. Intelligence will open doors for you, but humility will keep them open." David's eyes softened. He said quietly, "I understand that now." "I believe you do," Caprio said. "But understanding isn't about words. It's about what we choose to remember when pride tries to take the wheel again." The older man paused, the gavel resting gently in his hand. "You're a good lawyer, son. I can see that. You're quick, articulate, passionate. But passion without patience burns bridges faster than it builds them. The moment you think you're smarter than the system, or the people in it, you stop serving justice and start serving ego." The courtroom stayed still, absorbing the lesson. The hum of fluorescent lights, the distant shuffle of papers. Everything seemed muted under the weight of Caprio's calm wisdom. David lowered his gaze, no longer trying to argue, no longer performing. "You're right, Judge. I came in here trying to win, not to listen. I thought being right mattered more than being respectful." Caprio smiled. "You see, Mr. Lawson, you just won something far more valuable than a case." David looked up. "What's that, sir?" "The ability to admit you were wrong," Caprio said softly. "That's the real victory." A gentle silence followed. You could feel the energy in the room shift, from tension to respect. The audience, who'd come expecting entertainment, had just witnessed a lesson in grace. Caprio leaned back, folding his hands. "You know, humility isn't weakness. It's wisdom under control. It's knowing when to speak and when to stay silent. You're young, you'll make mistakes. But promise me this. When you stand in front of someone younger than you, someone as confident as you were today, remember this conversation." "Pass the lesson forward." David nodded firmly. "I will, Your Honor." "Good," Caprio said with a kind smile. "That's how the system stays honest. Not through punishment, but through people who learn and then teach." The older judge took a slow sip from his coffee before setting it down beside the gavel. He studied the young attorney for a moment longer, the faintest look of pride in his eyes. "Now," Caprio said finally, his tone turning lighter, "let's talk about your fine." David straightened again, half expecting another verbal spar. Caprio grinned. "Consider it paid, as in humility." Laughter erupted across the room. Relief replaced tension. Even David laughed this time, genuine and free. Caprio tapped the desk lightly. "And next time you're tempted to debate a judge, Counselor, just remember, the gavel always gets the last word." The courtroom laughed once more, not at David, but with him. The duel was over and there was no loser, only a lesson shared. David nodded respectfully. "Thank you, Your Honor, truly." Caprio smiled. "Lesson learned?" "Yes, sir," David said, his voice sincere. "Good," Caprio replied. "So now go out there and make sure every courtroom you enter remembers you for your respect, not your rebuttals." The audience broke into soft applause. Officers smiled. The clerk wiped away a tear she pretended was laughter. As David gathered his papers and turned to leave, the older attorney in the back row leaned over and whispered with a grin, Best continuing education course you'll ever get. Son, and free of charge. David smiled, shaking his head. Yeah, and worth every minute. He stepped out of the courtroom that day not just as an attorney, but as a man humbled, changed, by a judge who believed that the law at its best teaches more than it punishes. Judge Frank Caprio watched as David Lawson gathered his documents. The sharp edges of pride softened into something quieter. Gratitude. The courtroom, moments ago full of laughter and lesson, now felt like a sanctuary. The tension that once filled the space had turned into reflection. David turned back toward the bench one last time. "Thank you again, Your Honor," he said softly. Caprio smiled, a glint of humor still in his eyes. "You're welcome, Counselor. Remember, humility looks better on you than that expensive suit." The courtroom chuckled gently, and even David laughed, shaking his head. "I'll keep that in mind, Judge." Caprio raised his coffee cup in a small salute. "Good man." Case dismissed. The gavel came down, one single steady sound that carried more meaning than punishment ever could. Outside the courthouse, the air felt different. The late morning sun cast a warm glow across the steps as David paused halfway down. He looked back at the building, the same courthouse he had walked into so confidently only an hour earlier, and smiled faintly. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about winning or proving anyone wrong. He was thinking about the kind of man and lawyer he wanted to be. He reached into his briefcase, pulled out his phone, and typed a note to himself. Respect before rebuttal. Listen before leading. He didn't know it yet, but that note would one day sit framed on his office wall. Back inside, Judge Caprio leaned back in his chair, letting the last few moments linger in his mind. He wasn't smiling out of satisfaction. He was smiling because he had seen a transformation. Over the years, he had watched hundreds of people walk into that room. Angry drivers, nervous parents, arrogant professionals. Most came expecting punishment. Few left with perspective, but that morning was different. That morning, a young man had walked in with ego and walked out with understanding. The clerk, still smiling, leaned toward the bench. "That one was special, huh, Judge?" Caprio nodded. "They're all special in their own way. But that young man, he'll remember this one." That's how change starts. He picked up his coffee again, its steam curling softly upward. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "humility is like that cup of coffee. You don't appreciate how warm it is until life cools you down a little." The clerk laughed quietly. "You should write that on the wall, Judge." "Maybe I should," Caprio said with a wink. Later that week, the footage from the hearing appeared online. Someone in the courtroom had recorded it, not to mock, but to share the moment that had moved everyone there. The video opened with Judge Frank Caprio's calm smile and the young lawyer's confident tone. Viewers watched the playful sparring, the lesson, and finally the moment the judge quoted the lawyer's own ethics code back to him. Within days, the video spread across social media. Headlines read, "Judge Frank Caprio teaches. Humility to young attorney with grace. Experience meets ego in the most powerful courtroom. Moment you'll ever see." Comments poured in by the thousands. This wasn't a takedown. It was a masterclass in respect. Judge Caprio just reminded the world what leadership really looks like. I'm not even a lawyer, but this lesson hit home. Teachers played it in classrooms. Law professors showed it in ethics lectures. Parents sent it to their children as a reminder that no achievement is greater than character. At Lawson and Green, the story was the talk of the office. A few colleagues teased David at first, but every one of them admitted that moment had made them proud. Days later, David sat at his computer, staring at the firm's website. The same values page that Judge Caprio had quoted glowed on his screen. "We uphold integrity, respect and humility in every courtroom we enter," he smiled. Then scrolled to the bottom and added one more line. "And we remember that even the most educated still have lessons to learn." He hit save, leaned back in his chair and let out a deep breath. Not of defeat, but peace. Weeks passed, but that moment stayed with him. Every time he stood before a judge, he remembered that morning, the quiet authority in Caprio's tone, the warmth behind his words, and the way the courtroom had fallen into silence when truth was spoken with compassion. David began speaking at local law schools, sharing what he called the lesson of the gavel. He'd stand in front of students and tell them, "You'll win cases by being clever. But you'll earn respect by being kind. You'll get ahead by knowing the law, but you'll stay there by living its principles. Every time he spoke those words, he saw Judge Caprio's face in his mind, calm, knowing, proud. One quiet morning back in Providence Municipal Court, Judge Frank Caprio sipped his coffee before the day's hearings began. He looked out across the benches, sunlight pooling on the wooden floor. Every seat told a story. Every name on the docket represented someone with a mistake, a worry or a lesson waiting to happen. He smiled to himself. "That's the beauty of this place," he murmured quietly. "Justice isn't just about fines. It's about finding yourself again." The bailiff nodded respectfully. "You've seen a lot of that, huh, Judge?" Caprio chuckled softly. "More than I can count. But every so often one sticks with you, like that young lawyer, David Lawson. I hope he's doing well." And somewhere across town at that exact moment, David was holding a cup of coffee of his own, preparing to mentor a new intern at his firm. He smiled, remembering those exact words. Humility isn't weakness, it's wisdom under control. The moral of that day didn't end in a courtroom. It carried into homes, offices, and hearts, because sometimes all it takes is one moment, one sentence, one act of kindness to remind us that we're never done learning. Judge Frank Caprio had always believed that justice without compassion is just procedure. That morning he proved again that real justice doesn't humiliate. It educates, it heals, it restores. As the video continued to spread, news outlets began calling it the lesson in respect. It wasn't about humiliation or punishment, it was about perspective. A line from Judge Caprio's closing words became the heart of the story, shared thousands of times online. "The moment you think you're smarter than the system, you stop serving justice and start serving ego." People printed it, law students quoted it. And for a brief moment, in a noisy world, humility trended. That night, as the sun set over Providence, Judge Frank Caprio sat by his office window, the city lights blinking awake below him. He opened an old journal he often used for reflections and wrote one final note about that day. "The young lawyer taught me something too. Every time we pass a lesson, we relearn it ourselves." He smiled, closed the book, and looked out the window with quiet pride. Because for him, justice was never about rulings or records, it was about people. And sometimes, even the proudest hearts just need the right voice to remind them who they are. Reflection. In a world that rewards being loud, Judge Frank Caprio showed the power of being kind. He didn't win an argument, he changed a man's direction. So, friends, if this story touched your heart, share it with someone who could use the reminder. Like this video if you believe humility makes us stronger, not smaller, and subscribe for more real courtroom stories where wisdom meets warmth and justice meets humanity. Because in the courtroom of Judge Frank Caprio, every case is more than law, it's a mirror. And sometimes it reflects the best in us all.